Right then, we're going to continue with the first day of the second regional conference on IPCC on climate change. So we remind everybody that are here in the audience that we're transmitting through the orlac.org and that you can leave your questions in the chat of the page, and it also has simultaneous interpretation, 2 screens at a time, to English and Spanish. So the next panel, called Solutions on Mitigation and Adaptation, seeks to open the experiences in growth in Latin America, and it reaches climate change, the impacts, and the various topics. We'd like to welcome the panel members. Aroma Rey, Director of the Indigenous Settlements, and also it has made one of these the most important human settlements institutions in the implementation of the world and multidimensional opportunities of urbanization. We're also here with Deborah Lay, Economic Affairs Officer, Energy and Natural Resources Unit at ECLAC, specialist in renewable energies and climate change with a great trajectory on the local level, regional level, and in different sectors in clean energy mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Welcome, Deborah. We're also here with Hanok Barlevy, Regional Climate, Environment, and Disaster Resilience Advisors and Disaster Relief of UNICEF for Latin America and the Caribbean. He's worked more than 20 years in humanitarian and development context, focused on child affairs in Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. He's defended the mitigation of climate change and disasters, for example, focusing on children, youth. Welcome, Harriet. Here, we're also here with Patricia Romero, Senior Researcher at the Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and since 2018, with the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, University of Chicago, where she's a researcher. She studies the relationship between peoples and cities, focusing on ecosystem sustainability, mobility, as well as resilience to climate change. She was a main author of the second report and evaluation of IPCC. And today I'll leave you with Marcelo Mena, the moderator, member of the Fundación MERI board. He was undersecretary in the government of Chile and also part of the impulsing of policies in climate change and the creation of the coalition of the ministries of finance for tackling climate change. During his doctorate, he worked for various institutions in the US, Mexico, and Asia, where he tackled the quality of air. Marcelo Mena, I'll leave you in charge of this panel, Mitigation, Adaptation, Solutions. Thank you very much, Marisol. I'd like to thank the panel for participating. Just a brief introduction. Here, Latin America is more vulnerable than the rest of the continents through climate change. So inequality is a Achilles heel for what we want to do, and this has been shown by the pandemic, and it's going to be replicated in a context of climate change where the most vulnerable ones are going to be the most affected, and we need cities to be a vehicle. In the case of Chile, the vision of per capita requires things to be done, especially in efficient ways of living. At the same time, in this area, we're leading a battle for cleaner air. Mexico, Lima, Santiago have had large levels of contamination and have been tackled structurally. And in the integration of an atmospheric policy, and public policies can be the path to clean air. So then I'd like to talk with the panel, starting with Arma Revi in India. Fortunately, not able to be here, but they sent a recording, director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Arma, please go ahead. Hola, soy Arma Revi del Instituto Indio de Asentamientos Humanos en India. Fui uno de los autores coordinadores del informe del IPCC de 1.5C y también he estado involucrado en las negociaciones en las Naciones Unidas en torno a las metas de desarrollo sustentable y hoy voy a hablar de la convergencia en torno a acción climática y las SDGs integradas en SDG 13 dentro de ODS 13. Y una de las cosas críticas que dijimos en el informe de 1.5 es que hay una muy pequeña ventana de oportunidad para convertir la acción climática y la implementación de las ODS, especialmente porque tienen un marco limitado de tiempo. Tenemos que lograr mucho en menos de 10 años. Ahora, para el informe de 1.5, vamos a decir que cada décima de grado hace una diferencia crítica y eso es porque ya estamos cerca de los 1,2 grados sobre el promedio preindustrial en cuanto a temperatura. Los impactos climáticos son claramente visibles en el mundo, especialmente en el mundo en desarrollo, donde ambos países y personas son vulnerables. Uno de los puntos críticos que tenemos que tratar de hacer es, a diferencia del pasado, tenemos que unir el desarrollo sustentable, el abordar la pobreza y la acción climática. Si no hacemos que todas estas cosas sucedan en conjunto, el desafío va a ser, especialmente en un ambiente post-COVID, que todas las ganancias que hemos tenido en términos de desarrollo sustentable va a ser drásticamente impactado debido al clima. Por lo tanto, sería necesario implementar tres cosas: el desarrollo, mitigación de clima y adaptación climática. Una de las cosas importantes que se necesita el informe es que tenemos que simultáneamente implementarlas. No hay opción que tenemos en el momento, a diferencia de 30 años atrás, donde en Río de hacer una compensación de una por la otra. No, tenemos que implementarlas todas. Y una de las ideas claves que es importante que entendamos, ya sea en Latinoamérica, África, Asia, es que simultáneamente tenemos que implementar cuatro transiciones críticas de sistema. No son cosas que pueden suceder independientemente. Y quiero destacar cuáles son las transiciones. La primera es la transición energética, es bastante obvio, porque la transición de combustibles fósiles a energía y eficiencia energética va a involucrar una transformación significativa de los sistemas energéticos globales y locales. Tenemos que electrificar más sistemas, queremos implementar altos grados de eficiencia energética, queremos abordar toda una gama de otros gases de efecto invernadero, aparte de los que vemos y que provienen de los combustibles fósiles, incluyendo en la agricultura y sectores de pulpa y forestales, que es importante para muchas partes de Latinoamérica. Aparte de eso, también tenemos que implementar una transición difícil que es la industrial, que trata con in- los, digamos, materiales industriales que tienen un gran impacto, especialmente que involucran grandes cantidades de energía. Nuestras ciudades, sea cemento, vidrio, ladrillo, entre muchos otros que son parte de nuestro ambiente de construcción que se tiene que transformar. Y también tenemos desafíos importantes en términos de transporte, porque el comercio global depende de las embarcaciones y también transporte aéreo. Estos van a ser sectores difíciles de poder reducir las emisiones y transformar activamente, así que en conjunto la energía y la transición industrial van a ser críticos en el mundo para poder habilitar y permitir la acción climática, pero tiene que suceder en el contexto de desarrollo sostenible, lo que significa que tenemos que ver la creación de nuevas infraestructuras y la creación de nueva infraestructura, lo que, y empleos también, lo que nos permite tener una situación de cero neto ya llegando a los años 2050 y reduciendo las emisiones a finales de los 2030. Dos transiciones son muy importantes y críticas, son las transiciones de terrenos, tierra, océano, ecosistema, y también el tema de los glaciales es muy importante, es la tercera transición. La cuarta es la urbana y la infraestructura también es muy importante porque en las áreas urbanas y en estos sistemas en torno al mundo encontramos la oportunidad no solamente de reducir 80% de las emisiones del mundo, pero también construir pueblos y ciudades resilientes.
Eso que se puedan construir con el impacto considerable que veremos a medida que aumentan las temperaturas. Por supuesto que este informe de 1,5 nos indica que si podemos limitar o restringir este aumento promedio de la temperatura global a 1,5 grados, la cantidad de impacto que veremos será mucho menor que 2 grados, que si aumentáramos a 2 grados. Vemos las contribuciones determinadas a nivel nacional que han sido acordadas bajo el Acuerdo de París, que nos lleva mucho más cerca de estos niveles. Es lo que hemos mostrado en la evaluación actual de la IPCC y en la evaluación anterior de la que yo fui parte en el año 5, que va a crear una disrupción significativa, no solamente para los sistemas ecológicos, sino también al desarrollo en todo el mundo, particularmente en un ambiente en el cual en muchos casos hemos visto un retroceso después del COVID. Esto se convierte en una situación crítica. En términos prácticos, en políticas públicas, hay programas de reconstrucción post-COVID, programas de recuperación para poder crear empleos y oportunidades laborales. Deben estar en conformidad con nuestras expectativas de la meta de 1,5 grados. La implementación de todas estas transiciones, la económica, industrial, de los ecosistemas y de los sistemas terrestres y las infraestructuras urbanas deben estar aunados. Para hacer estos esfuerzos posibles, realizamos un análisis bastante detallado de 25 opciones de mitigación críticas y adaptación también, que ven en detalle este plan para alrededor del mundo. Lo que descubrimos es que hay una serie de opciones que nos pueden habilitar a alcanzar esto de una manera sistemática y, por supuesto, lo que tiene que ver con las opciones es que cada país, cada región debe poder escoger lo que sea mejor para ellos, por lo que existe un marco para ver qué funciona mejor para cada caso. Para que estas opciones sean eficaces, debemos habilitar una serie de lo que llamamos condiciones habilitantes. Para ello, el desarrollo sustentable requiere mucha inversión y así poder permitir el levantamiento e implementación, despliegue de todas estas medidas alrededor del mundo. ¿Cuáles son estas condiciones habilitantes? La primera de ellas, muy importante, es una gobernanza adecuada para que el gobierno pueda tener la gobernanza de los sistemas económicos, sociales y ecológicos a niveles múltiples, a nivel local, regional y, por supuesto, a escala global, porque el cambio climático es algo que nos afecta en un amplio rango de procesos a nivel mundial. Segundo, son las finanzas. Ha habido mucha discusión al respecto y se necesita mucho trabajo, lo que nos mostró el informe del 1,5 grados es que los compromisos no están ocurriendo en muchos países. Aún se necesita mejoras en ellos. Tenemos que movilizar las finanzas de 5 a 6 veces más de lo que se acordó en el Acuerdo de París para poder realizar estas transiciones de manera eficaz. Para que la gobernanza y las finanzas funcionen, tenemos que tener acción local en las instituciones a nivel de pueblos, ciudades, país, para que todo esto ocurra. Y esto no va a suceder a menos que tengamos innovación tecnológica en todo el mundo, que por cierto requiere mucho trabajo con las corporaciones, por lo que la acción climática y el desarrollo sustentable, como sabemos, es algo en la que las corporaciones van a ser críticas. Y finalmente nada de esto va a ocurrir a menos que cada uno de nosotros, cada uno de los ciudadanos alrededor del mundo pueda participar en una manera equitativa, porque uno de los desafíos más significativos que vemos mundialmente es que algunos países y algunas regiones aún siguen en la pobreza y pobreza económica en muchos sentidos, y que tenemos este desafío de la energía también y de la inequidad que vienen a la delantera luego de la crisis global del COVID, lo que significa es que no podrán participar completamente en los procesos de desarrollo sustentable y acción climática. Así es que los ciudadanos son esenciales, nuestras opciones de estilos de vida son muy importantes. Es el rol de los ciudadanos que me parece en nuestra experiencia nos dice que puede realizar un cambio significativo, porque este cambio debe ocurrir en una década o menos, y para ello todos somos esenciales, los países, las empresas locales, los gobiernos locales, la sociedad civil con sus instituciones y finalmente cada uno de nosotros como individuos, como ciudadanos. Así es que esperamos que Latinoamérica, con su rol crítico para el mundo, viva estos puntos de inflexión, lo evalúen y, por supuesto, Latinoamérica ha guiado este proceso para definir los objetivos de desarrollo sustentable y combatir la inequidad social. Esperamos con ansias la discusión amplia de estos problemas y de sus celebraciones el día de hoy. Muchas gracias, ha sido un placer unirme a ustedes. Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation and emphasizing on the importance of achieving SDGs in sustainable fashion so that this is effective, because natural disasters in Latin America, for example, what we saw in Guatemala recently, where there was a hurricane and the poorest quintiles lost 30% of their income and the richest ones only 3%. If we want to face climate change, it is necessary to address inequality and poverty in an integrated fashion. Now I will continue with Deborah Lay, who's an ECLAC official in economic affairs, energy, and natural resources. Deborah, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, both the IPCC and Fundación MERI, for this invitation to participate in this important panel. I will continue what Arl was mentioning about the transition. We worked both on the 1.5-degree report of the IPCC. Could you please put up my presentation on screen? Speaking of the second slide about the different transitions, we have energy and industry, land and other ecosystems, the urban and infrastructure one, another category that we call it overarching, because these are options that belong to each one of the transition systems. So one of the objectives, well, the main goal of working under system transitions was to jointly analyze the transitions in social technology transitions and the resistance this is bringing into the same framework, the adaptation and mitigation measures, and leaving the sectoral silos. This part of the transitions not only help us to analyze jointly mitigation and adaptation, but also to see the interlinkages of interdependency within transition system and between one and the other. We can see, for example, how there are elements or options of the energy system, for example, the use of water that could have an impact on land and ecosystems, and the use of energy in urban and infrastructure system because of the patterns of consumption impacting the industry and the land. This is a framework that we are working on, our AR6. Next slide, please. We have spoken much about, well, in the first panel, about the needs of adaptation, and despite we need to adapt, we must also think about a gradual and incremental change that we are using today in this model. In a transformational adaptation, the main difference is that transformational adaptation changes main attributes of the socio-ecological system, anticipating the climate change and the impacts, but in a more relevant way, more linked to the sustainable development. And this transformational adaptation forces us to see the root causes of vulnerability. And in many of these cases, as you well put it, uh, we find poverty. So what causes vulnerability? What are the causes of poverty? How can we eliminate this, bearing in mind that we will reach a point where the adaptation measures will not be, the current ones will not be enough, and we will need transformational adaptation. Moving on to the next slide, here I'm showing the different options of adaptation that we're taking for the energy, land, and urban systems. You can see here the variety, the diversity, and then we performed an analysis of synergies and trade-offs between every adaptation option with adaptation and vice versa, with every option of adaptation with mitigation. Next slide, please. Here you can see different categories. One of those that I didn't mention previously was the carbon dioxide removal, which is a mitigation option, as was presented by Telma in her summary of the 1.5 report. The more we take in reducing emissions, the more we'll need to use, but options such as afforestation and reforestation that we see in nature that could be used in a more sustainable fashion. But there are others based on technology, such as the ones listed on screen, where you can see significant trade-offs with the different objectives of sustainable development. So it was important to gain some balance. Next one, please. The feasibility study that Arnold started to mention addressed different aspects, different dimensions: economic, technological, institutional, sociocultural, environmental, ecological, and geophysical. We see the adaptation and mitigation was we had 19 and 24 indicators, but this allowed us to see within each category what are the impacts, not only at the economic and technology levels, but also what are the mechanisms for transparency, acceptability, and how much do these allow or worsen gender perspectives, if there are social benefits, cultural benefits, how much we see in regional inclusion. And on the side of the environmental aspect, we try to proceed in ecological capacity, adaptation, impacts on biodiversity and pollution. So we try to see if each of each option under the six dimensions and each one of the indicators. This helps us to create a more comprehensive scheme involving all of the options and what they mean. Here I would like to present to you, just to finish, two examples. One of those is about the energy systems. Here you can appreciate the different mitigation options with the synergies and trade-offs with adaptation. And despite we can see there are many synergies, as one can imagine, with the use of renewable energies, we see some trade-offs with adaptation. For instance, if a renewable energy system does not meet all of the standards or safety and reliability measures, particularly, or standards, particularly in areas where we have seen these don't work when they should, with some controller blowing up behind the heads of the users. But however, by performing this, the implementation and using the enabling conditions properly that Otto was mentioning, we can see many synergies that help us not only to reduce emissions, but also to increase resiliency and ability to adapt. Next slide, please. These are other examples about the urban and infrastructure systems, where you see a series of options of adaptation with many synergies. Actually, the urban system is the one that presented most synergies between adaptation and mitigation, and the trade-offs were more based on the different uses of water and vegetation and how these could change. For example, in the water stress areas. This can be found in the fourth chapter of the special report on the 1.5 global warming, as it was mentioned by Aromar and Thelma. We need to take into consideration not all of these dimensions, but the different sustainable development goals and the sustainable development in general in the long term. Next slide, please. You see my contact information on screen if you have other questions after these sessions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah, for your excellent presentation that at the same time was very well linked to what Aramar was saying earlier. Now, with the regional manager of natural disasters, climate and disaster risk, environment and climate. Thank you so much, Marcelo. Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon. Could you put up my presentation, please? First, I would like to thank Fundación MEDI and the Chilean government for inviting me to participate in the second conference of the IPCC on climate change in the region. On behalf of UNICEF, it is a great honor and a pleasure to be with you virtually in this panel. Thank you so much, Marcelo, and the rest of the members of this panel. I will switch to English with your permission. Me gustaría hacer eco de lo que han mencionado los otros panelistas anteriores, al decir que la crisis climática es una crisis de toda la sociedad, crisis de los niños. Por lo tanto, debemos verlo también desde la mitigación como de la adaptación. En el informe de la IPCC ya vimos y lo vemos día a día cuánto y cómo la región se está convirtiendo en una región vulnerable, más vulnerable cada minuto, cada hora con el impacto del clima. Por tanto, lo que estamos haciendo es intentar analizar el compromiso, los diferentes compromisos, tanto con la mitigación como con la adaptación. Si vemos ahora los 33 países que suscribieron sus determinaciones a nivel nacional, podemos ver definitivamente una gradualidad de los compromisos. Vemos un análisis de el sector, de todos los sectores. Vemos el tema de saneamiento de agua, protección social. También vemos que con los compromisos la brecha es aún grande para poder mitigar los impactos del calentamiento global. Próxima, por favor. Muchas gracias. Por tanto, lo que es imperativo es que analicemos la acción climática desde un enfoque integrativo, con la integración de la mitigación, adaptación y también los co-beneficios. Por ejemplo, podríamos, podríamos ver las energías renovables. No sé si pueden ver mi presentación bien. Creo que tengo algunos problemas de conexión. Si es que me pueden avisar si me... Ah, ok, me escuchan entonces ahora. Cuando estamos planificando las energías renovables en los diferentes sectores, y la reducción de las emisiones y haciendo que la energía sea más eficiente en la educación, salud, saneamiento de aguas, no solo estamos ayudando con la mitigación, sino también estamos creando y habilitando sociedades, familias y niños más resilientes. Y esto solo es posible si es que estamos enlazando, vinculando todos los diferentes segmentos de la sociedad, incluyendo el gobierno, el sector privado, la comunidad, como también la sociedad civil y particularmente a los jóvenes, los niños y adolescentes que tienen algo que decir al respecto. Muchas gracias. Próxima. Me gustaría abordar rápidamente unos pocos ejemplos. En la educación, si es que realmente queremos hacer un cambio, debemos asegurar que todos los niños en esta generación estén aprendiendo sobre el impacto del cambio climático y la degradación medioambiental para que sea algo universal. Específicamente, si es que intentamos alcanzar a las comunidades más desaventajadas, más remotas de la red, y aplicando energías renovables, explicando las soluciones locales, también podríamos así crear y habilitar el acceso al agua potable, a la electricidad, la luz, la conectividad, el aprendizaje digital, todo lo que hoy se convierte en un componente crítico para asegurar y permitir que los niños continúen aprendiendo. Estamos así apoyando y habilitando y mejorando el nivel de aprendizaje, particularmente sobre el clima y el medio ambiente, y también creando todas las comunidades con facilidades que no tenían antes, gracias a las energías renovables con soluciones locales. Próxima, por favor. Otro aspecto importante es la generación de evidencia. Nos estamos dando cuenta ahora de que nos falta evidencia. Necesitamos mayor evidencia para poder apoyar a los diferentes sectores y así convertirnos en sistemas más resilientes y predecibles frente a las condiciones climáticas cambiantes que afectan, en el caso de la salud, afectando las condiciones sanitarias. Vemos esto en colaboración con la Agencia Europea Espacial, intentando comprender la correlación entre las condiciones cambiantes climáticas y el cambio en las condiciones sanitarias, tomando la enfermedad de vector de dengue y la Amazonía de Perú. Mediante la generación de evidencia, pudimos apoyar al sector sanitario para que sea más predecible y resiliente frente a estas condiciones. Gracias.
Y por supuesto que los niños, los adolescentes, los jóvenes se convierten en agentes de cambio y tenemos que fijarnos en esto y apoyar esto. Tenemos que asegurar de que esta generación de los adultos de mañana y los líderes de mañana de nuestra sociedad realmente toman en cuenta esto, son escuchados y toman acciones. Y no es suficiente, tenemos que asegurarnos de que toda la sociedad entienda la implicancia del cambio climático y tenemos que asegurarnos de que hay un lenguaje común para que se entienda y se traduzca el idioma científico para que todo se pueda entender, en particular los jóvenes, y eh, para que ellos vean el futuro que haga nuestra sociedad mejor y más resiliente enfrentando la crisis climática. Por lo tanto, tenemos que crear herramientas y espacios y diálogo que hay entre la generación actual y que se crea esta generación, intergeneración y diálogos. Para concluir, voy a tratar de mantenerlo breve también. Para poder abordar la crisis climática, realmente tenemos que basarnos en los tres pilares. Primero, es un enfoque de múltiples actores de interés. Tenemos que asegurarnos de que estamos trabajando en sinergia con todos los grupos de interés. Segundo, es unas sinergias intersectoriales, tenemos que trabajar en coordinación, tenemos que coordinar entre sectores y nos dimos cuenta de esto en la crisis de COVID-19. Un sector no puede abordarlo solo, se requiere tener un trabajo intersectorial complementario para enfrentar a cualquier crisis y desafío. Y por último, pero no menos importante, es un abordamiento inclusivo. La crisis climática es una crisis de toda la sociedad, por lo tanto tenemos que asegurar de que todos estén incluidos, en particular los niños más vulnerables, grupos étnicos, personas con discapacidades, entre otros. Tenemos que dejar a nadie atrás y construirlo en conjunto. Gracias. Thank you very much for your presentation. And now we're going to continue talking about energy with our last panel member, Patricia Romero, senior researcher at the Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory of the US. So we're going to close this panel with them, and you could send us your questions on the platform so we could send it to the panel members. So the floor is yours, Patricia. Thank you very much. Can you please put the slides on the screen? So before I start, I'd like to thank everybody for the opportunity of being with you. And I'm very happy as well to having had Debbie and Aromar before me because it truly facilitates what I want to say. Could you please put my presentation on screen, please? Well, yes, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'll continue. So I'm really impressed that we're talking about many transformations. We're facing the challenge of transforming our ways of production. Importantly, and a fundamental element of these transformations have to do with social practices, the imagination, forms of culture, and political structures of our countries. And this is imperative in Latin America, Asia, and the US. And this is due to the experience we have working in field in India, China, Mexico, where I come from. And also I've worked in Chile, Argentina, etc. So what's very important is that when we're talking about transformations, we have to start breaking off this idea that the only thing we need to understand the challenges in water and energy in terms of health based on this, and we need to talk about the solutions that the decision makers and people are going to act consequently. So then we have already talked about this in various publications that we've created together, and this will take us to focus together on what we call the superficial elements of the superficial levers for changes. So we can tell people you need to change your behavior. Don't use plastic anymore. Use public transport. Don't consume as much energy. So what we forget sometimes is that this type of interventions are not going to be enough. Why? And here is where I want to consider the following dimension of intervention, of searching for solutions, that has to do with the infrastructure characteristics and environments that are built. For example, we have in the cities and in the fields and the countryside, we have here the interventions on the configuration of our water systems, our energy systems, our transport systems. This element is deeper and more difficult to reach and it goes beyond the capacity of intervention on the individual level that decision makers may have. For example, we can tell people in Latin America that live in areas for risk, in, for example, hurricanes or floods. We could tell them that, but it's very difficult to ask people to move to another place or to build their homes in a more permanent manner. So when they don't have the structural elements that support them. So then we have this second level, which is in greater depth that we also have to consider. So there's another level that is even deeper, which is a systemic level, which has to do with the mental models and the paradigms and our expectations on how we need to work. So here I want to talk about a very beautiful example of work we did in the field with decision makers, with representatives of the private sector in Mexico City, where we were thinking of how we could turn our transport system, how we could change it. And they said it justly, we don't want to tackle it. They said what we need is to change the paradigm that's focused on cars, on having private cars. This paradigm is so strong, this system, this way of thinking, of considering the transport system is so deeply rooted in our mental models that sometimes we forget that while we don't change that system, it's going to be very difficult to change our transport model. I also see this while working with engineers who I work with, and they've been colleagues that are very creative, committed, innovative. And we were just thinking that the decarbonization of the transport system and transit system has to do with replacing cars of internal combustion engines with electric cars. We're going to forget that what's being and what's affecting us in Latin American cities is the fact that we are focused on a individual use of cars that generates congestion, generates externalities to other sectors. And here we could talk about a series of other examples of what we need to transform. So if we talk about the point that Debbie and Aroma mentioned of all the systems that we need to transform, I believe that the most fundamental one, as they pointed out as well, the one that we need to start with is the socio-technical political system for the configuration of our transport infrastructures, water, energy. And these are the ones we need to attack, not just the individual ones or the individual aspects. And I'm sorry, there's no PowerPoint here that I wanted to share with you. I'm sorry they can't show it, but I've had field work with decision makers, communities, etc. And I want to say that transitions are sustained on the cultural and political values of the social political stakeholders, and these stakeholders have different levels of power, intervention capacity to be able to imagine the future. I'd like to share with you a very beautiful image and that a colleague of mine in Canada, Sarah Bush, shared of what the future would be in cities in Canada. And please notice that it's very important. This is the future of the upper middle class of the global north. It's a future where we have green areas, bike paths, and where pedestrians can walk. But these are worlds and futures that don't necessarily correspond with the futures of other communities in a very great exercise that we carried out last year in the lab. We involved labs, different communities, and also engineers in imagining the future. It was very interesting and noting. And here we imagined the future of many cities. One of them was San Juan from Puerto Rico. And I can't share the picture, but I would love for you to imagine what they what they imagined the future to be of San Juan and what it would imply. What they did was to paint a picture of a coastal area with flowers, with a tropical climate, with climate and colors that can only be seen in tropical areas of Latin America, and with great joy. That's a different future from the future that other communities wanted, other decision makers had in mind, and other stakeholders can imagine. So when we're thinking of these transformations, it's important to always ask ourselves, who are we thinking of for this future? Who's going to be named and shown in this configuration of the future? And who is thinking of this future for who, where, and when? If we don't answer these questions, which are questions that are going to give us a series of elements that will capture a fair transitions, we're not going to be able to transit anywhere because what's very common in Latin America is that we configure, for example, wind power systems or solar power systems that are implanted in indigenous zones and that do not consider the needs, the priorities of communities that are being established. So it's very interesting and important to emphasize the meaning or the importance of the cultural aspects, political aspects of decision making, who has the power to define the future, and also equality. I would say that these are the entry points and not just an element that cross-cuts different sectors or systems that were proposed by Aroma. And I just wanted to say that based on all of this, many workshops that we've organized to tackle this different way of configuring transitions, and since in my lab we specialized in providing technical assistance, what we're doing is we're questioning this idea that there's a technocratic tackling of construction of solutions and that the construction of solutions has to be proposed with the different stakeholders that are political and social in the various communities, cities, and zones which we are working with, and that these have to be sensitive to the realities of the realities that we're working in. This means that we truly have to frame ourselves in inclusive processes, not top down processes, but bottom up that would allow for the configuration of our ideas of the future, which is also very important. And it's very difficult to achieve this. And I know from experience is to try to create synergies among the climate change priorities. So we know we have to change the world in 2 seconds and we're out of time, basically. Even so, we still need to build frameworks that allow us to build synergies with the priorities of communities and the popular sectors that we're working with. And otherwise, we'll continue producing these exclusionary systems that are one of the greatest challenges that Latin America has faced historically. We need to break with these mechanisms of colonialism and impose ideas that are more progressive and that are necessary, and we need to build spaces where realities of the communities we work with are. Apologies, there's a cut in the audio. And I'd like to thank everybody for the opportunity in presenting. I would have loved to have shown the presentation. You would have loved it, but I want to say that it is possible to build these futures and transformations in a more inclusive manner. This does require patience, work, and efforts that we're not used to making and having. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patricia. I'm going to quickly start with a question from the audience for you, and then I'll start with one for Manoj. Power consumption, energy consumption is related to behaviors. You mentioned this related to transport. How do we change to sustainable urban models if we think of that DF example, the city of Mexico? It's a fundamental question. Now, we have to do this, and I believe that the authorities are already working on this, and we are in collaboration with them. So we have to think on what the realities are of Mexico City. My technical team had the idea that what we would have to electrify in DF are what we call the buses, the public transport buses, but politically in Mexico City, it would be more difficult, more time to be able to have electrical minibuses. So what we started doing is electrifying, for example, motorbikes that right now are giving mobility opportunities, and these are more accessible to sectors. It doesn't matter if we don't have electric bikes, but people are using motorbikes to transport, for example, food, for example, Uber, and to transport as a personal transport. So, what I'm saying is that we cannot reach, and I'm talking from the point of view of the US, and I know being Latin America that we cannot come with an idea of what should be that's opposite to them. The construction of options have to be consensual in the different areas, and we're doing this in many cities of Latin America, but it has to be done in a consensual fashion and not imposed. So I would have to say that the person that asked me, yes, Pati, this is really beautiful to say, but it's very difficult to do. And yes, that's true. It's difficult to implement solutions when we have consensus. But if we don't do it that way, we're going to continue building resentment among the popular sectors that continue seeing that we do not consider their realities and their needs.
So we have the tools to achieve that. So I ask the person who asked the question to give me time to follow up on this because we already have the tools. However, these are tools not only technical. That is the key message that I wanted to convey. Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia. Indeed, in cities such as Santiago, we have been a raise in the use of motorbikes, and despite the low emissions with the pandemic and transport industry in general, there was an increase in the carbon due to the use of motorbikes for delivery systems. There are many people working on that, and of course, created an impact with higher emissions. And we are seeing more inclusion of electromobility with electric scooters, and that would be the cheapest option for electric vehicles because we still need a higher subsidy for the electromobility to happen broadly. But I wanted to mention something about the citizenship. President Bachelet on the 1st of June, and I think in the first term, she said the environmental education will be adapted for every classroom in Chile. And there are courses today called Sciences for the Citizenship, which includes this view to teach citizenship about mitigation adaptation in line with the local implications. So the question is, how fundamental could this citizens' input be if we still have dirty policies in Latin America and being this more expensive? I personally don't think it's the case, but the question goes for you regarding the citizens' role in choosing cleaner solutions, seeing that there are larger processes and not necessarily you can have access due to price concerns or other reasons. Thank you, Marcelo. Just to continue with the line of thought by Patricia, and I would like to say that in the end, we see the government commitments and commitments from other stakeholders, but it is the key message that says that it's responsibility of every citizen, every individual, that starts with the individual behaviors. So we can actually mitigate the transport, but we can also change our behavior. We can choose to use other transport means that are more sustainable. And but the point is that first we need education. If all of the information and the learning from science cannot be transferred to every citizen, it becomes a huge challenge, because it's only when we understand that the climate crisis is not far from us, it's not someone else's, it's not affecting a different continent, but here, it's here and it's today. uh, Every citizen must understand the implications. So that's why we're working along with governments that understand that today it is no longer an option to have climate related education or environmental education as a key part of schooling, but also mandatory. That's how we're working with governments in the region through UNICEF, NUMA, UNESCO, and other agencies too, with MEDI Foundation as well, and other regional institutions, national institutions, in order to create the conditions, the enabling conditions for all citizens to properly understand the implications of their behavior that we can change. And that change will only happen when each one of us does something. That is true. It is expensive at the time, it's more expensive, and we must also change that paradigm that is only the market, because we're still working with a concept that we need to produce more, that we need to consume more to maintain our sustainable economy. However, we are understanding slowly that that is not enough. We must create an economy that is more sustainable in terms of climate and environment. And that is the main challenge for all of us. So just to summarize my point, I'm saying that this is an all society concept. Everyone must sacrifice or adapt their actions and move towards more sustainable activities. We must learn first, and if we don't have the knowledge or the information, it will be very hard to expect that people start changing their behavior. Therefore, we insist, we urge governments that environmental and climate education is urgent and mandatory. Shouldn't happen tomorrow, but today. Start with this, and this is our message for all governments. And I would also like to remind you of another component. It's not only in school, but there are other means to convey this information. We listen to the youth who are taking action, who are paying attention, and they are calling upon us adults and decision makers to change. We need to be inclusive. and make sure that there's information and participation in a continuous fashion, and inclusion of all sectors. All of the social sectors should be a part of these actions on climate change, not only focusing on the ones that usually focus on, such as the energy, transport, industry sectors that are very pertinent, of course, but we must also ensure that everyone, every social sector is involved in this and is a part of the climate related decisions. Thank you. Thank you, Anoj. And with that, we finish this panel on mitigation and adaptation from the perspective of cities and energy. Up next, we'll continue with our next panel. Thank you so much for attending. That was Marcelo Mena. Thank you for leading that panel called Solutions of Mitigation and Adaptation. Thanks also to the panel members. Let us take a break of 15 minutes. We will leave you with the documentary, a production of Daniel Casado jointly with Fundación Meri, and up to date, who has received more than 8 international awards from Colombia, Canada, Malaysia, Argentina, and Chile, among others. We'll meet again in a few minutes. We'll be back by 1:30.